The reign of King Charles II of England, often referred to as the Restoration period, was one of the most fascinating and transformative eras in British history. Spanning from 1660 to 1685, Charles's rule marked the return of the monarchy after a period of republican governance that followed the English Civil War. His reign saw the reconstruction of the monarchy and the re-establishment of the Church of England, both of which had been significantly altered during the period of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. However, Charles's time on the throne was far from uneventful, as his reign was also marked by political intrigue, religious tension, and military conflict. Charles was born on May 29, 1630, the eldest surviving son of King Charles I and Henrietta Maria of France. His early life was marked by privilege, but it would soon be overshadowed by the turmoil of the English Civil War. Charles's father, Charles I, was a monarch whose policies and belief in the divine right of kings led to a clash with Parliament. This tension eventually resulted in the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642, a conflict between the Royalists, who supported the king, and the Parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell. Following the defeat of the Royalists and the execution of Charles I in 1649, the monarchy was abolished, and England was declared a republic under Cromwell's leadership. Charles, only 19 years old at the time, was forced into exile in mainland Europe, spending much of his youth in France, the Netherlands, and other parts of Europe. This period of exile shaped Charles's character and his future approach to leadership. It also allowed him to observe the political dynamics of continental Europe, which would later influence his dealings with Parliament and his foreign policy. During the years of the Commonwealth, Charles made several unsuccessful attempts to regain the throne, relying on alliances with foreign powers and royalist supporters within England. The most notable of these efforts was the Battle of Worcester in 1651, where Charles was defeated by Cromwell's forces. After the battle, he famously fled to France, hiding in an oak tree at Boscobel House, an incident that would become legendary in British history as the Royal Oak story. Despite these setbacks, Charles II remained a symbol of the royalist cause, and the hope of restoring the monarchy remained alive among many Englishmen. In 1660, the political situation in England changed dramatically. Following the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658 and the brief rule of his son Richard Cromwell, the political system established by the Commonwealth began to unravel. The English people, weary of republican rule and the military dictatorship of Cromwell, increasingly sought the return of the monarchy. In this context, Charles II was invited to return to England by the Convention Parliament, which had been convened in the spring of 1660 to resolve the crisis. On May 29, 1660, Charles was proclaimed king and made his triumphal return to England. His entry into London was met with widespread celebrations, and the monarchy was formally restored. This event, known as the Restoration, marked the end of nearly 2 decades of republican rule and the return of a more traditional form of government. Charles's accession to the throne represented not only the restoration of the monarchy, but also a reconciliation between the monarchy and the English people, many of whom had been deeply disillusioned by the political chaos of the preceding years. Charles's reign was marked by efforts to stabilize the monarchy and repair the damage caused by the Civil War and the Commonwealth. His government faced the challenge of restoring royal authority while managing the competing interests of Parliament, the military, and the emerging political factions. One of the key elements of Charles's political strategy was his use of personal charisma and diplomacy to maintain his power. He was a master of managing political relationships and skillfully navigated the complexities of the English political system. One of Charles's primary objectives upon his return to the throne was to heal the divisions caused by the Civil War and to restore the authority of the monarchy. However, this was not an easy task. The English population had been deeply divided by the conflict, and many still harbored strong loyalties to the memory of their fallen monarch, Charles I. At the same time, there were significant factions within Parliament that were hostile to royal power and skeptical of the king's intentions. Charles was able to gain the support of many of these factions by promising to respect the powers of Parliament and uphold the laws of the land. However, tensions between the king and Parliament remained a constant feature of his reign. A key aspect of Charles's reign was his religious policy. The king himself was a devout Anglican, but his religious policies were shaped by the need to balance the interests of the various religious groups within England, including Anglicans, Puritans, and Catholics. While England was officially Protestant, Catholics still constituted a significant minority, and many Catholics hoped for greater religious toleration under Charles's rule. The religious question was further complicated by the fact that Charles's younger brother, James, Duke of York, had converted to Catholicism. The prospect of a Catholic monarch succeeding Charles created widespread fear among Protestants, leading to the emergence of the so-called Popish plot in the 1670s, a fabricated conspiracy that accused Catholics of plotting to assassinate the king and restore Catholicism. This created a climate of suspicion and religious division that would have lasting consequences for the future of the monarchy. Charles sought to avoid open conflict with a parliament over religious issues, but his attempts to grant religious toleration to Catholics and dissenters were met with resistance. The Declaration of Indulgence in 1672, which granted religious freedom to non-Anglican Protestants and Catholics, was especially controversial and led to widespread protests from the Anglican establishment. Parliament forced Charles to withdraw the declaration, and the king was forced to rely on more subtle methods of managing religious dissent. In terms of foreign policy, Charles faced several challenges, particularly in his relationship with the European powers. His reign saw England engaged in multiple conflicts, most notably the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667, and the Franco-Dutch War, 1672 to 1678. Charles was heavily influenced by his desire to maintain England's naval power, and he sought alliances with both France and the Dutch Republic at different points during his reign. The Second Anglo-Dutch War was largely a result of competition for naval supremacy and trade routes, particularly in the East Indies. The war ended with a humiliating defeat for England in 1667, culminating in the Dutch burning of the British fleet at the Battle of Medway. This defeat exposed the weaknesses of the English navy and demonstrated the limits of Charles's military power. Despite the failure of the war, Charles was able to negotiate a peace settlement with the Dutch, which allowed England to maintain a degree of influence in European affairs. Charles's foreign policy was also shaped by his relationship with France. In 1670, Charles entered into a secret treaty with Louis XIV of France, known as the Treaty of Dover. The treaty committed Charles to supporting France in its wars against the Dutch, in exchange for financial support from the French crown. This alliance, while beneficial in the short term, further alienated Protestant opinion in England and led to increased fears of French influence and Catholicism. Charles's reign was also marked by significant domestic challenges. In 1665, England was ravaged by the Great Plague, which killed an estimated 100,000 people, or 1/4 of London's population. The plague had a profound impact on English society, and the king's government struggled to contain the outbreak. Just 1 year later, in 1666, London was struck by the Great Fire, which destroyed much of the city, including thousands of homes, churches, and businesses. The fire, while a catastrophe, also offered an opportunity for rebuilding, and Charles II played a key role in overseeing the reconstruction of London. Despite these domestic crises, Charles II's popularity among the English people remained relatively high, particularly in comparison to the rigid and authoritarian rule of his father, Charles I. Charles's ability to restore a sense of stability to England after the chaos of the Civil War and the Commonwealth played a key role in solidifying his position on the throne. Charles died on February 6, 1685, after a reign of 25 years. His death was attributed to complications from a stroke, and he was succeeded by his brother, James II. Charles's death marked the end of an era of relative stability, but it also set the stage for future political conflict, particularly due to the Catholic sympathies of James II. Charles II's legacy is complex. On one hand, he successfully restored the monarchy and navigated the challenges of post-Civil War England with considerable skill and diplomacy. His reign was marked by a flourishing of culture, including the beginnings of the English Enlightenment and the rise of scientific discoveries, many of which were supported by Charles. On the other hand, his failure to resolve the religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants, and his reliance on foreign alliances that alienated many of his subjects, set the stage for later conflicts that would culminate in the Glorious Revolution of 1688.